Obviously, the primary criterion for objectively rating the best single-handed sword is how well it dual wields, which is why rapiers are trashed here. So it's pulling your leg in a number of ways there. First off, there is no objective way to rate anything. Second, it's definitely not whether or not you can dual wield a sword. And third, rapiers were apparently dual wielded, at least in specific contexts. That does in fact show up in historical manuscripts. Personally, I would not recommend it. Rapier and daggers, a little bit more practical. So in the past, I've talked extensively about why there is no such thing as the ultimate sword, the single best of everything. The question is always the best at what? What are we talking about? Dual, battlefield, armored, unarmored, etc., etc. There are lots of different factors. But I'm going to narrow it down for this one to single-handed swords, and we're going to look at 3 different contexts: battlefield, duel, self-defense. By duel, I mean a formal duel, like a judicial duel, or it could also be an illegal private duel that is still held with certain formalities and rules in mind. Whereas self-defense means, in an everyday context, on the street, you carry something, you're being attacked, you have to defend yourself right then, no prep time. How am I even going to approach the staggering variety of swords from different time periods all over the world, different cultures? Well, mainly by sticking to what I have first-hand experience with, which in turn is determined by what's available on the reproduction market, and also by not being afraid of a little bias. You can't escape bias. It comes not only from what you personally prefer, but also from what you know and don't know. So of course, I'm going to be leaning more toward things that I'm more familiar with and that I personally like. For the sake of brevity, I'm not going to name every single sword in existence. We'd be here for 10 plus hours. And for those of you who can't resist in response to the question, which is the best sword, to type a gun, yes, you are that predictable, I have 2 things for you. 1, an entire firearms playlist on my channel that you can watch one-handed. It's in a card up there and link down below. And 2, today's sponsor, which is full of guns. The World War II multiplayer shooter Enlisted. If you appreciate historical authenticity, Enlisted puts quite a bit of emphasis on it while maintaining dynamic, action-packed gameplay. Darkflow software didn't skimp on the presentation either. I like the realistic weapon and vehicle models as well as the impressive fire and smoke effects. A lot of stuff on the map is destructible, so even if you're a noob who can't hit anyone yet, at least you can vent your frustration on some inanimate objects. Or better, sneak up on some fool with your sword and ask him how obsolete it feels now. If you catch one too many bullets, you can switch to another soldier in your squad. You only need to respawn after the entire squad has been wiped. Enlisted is available on PC, Xbox One, Series X and S, and PS4 and 5 with cross-platform support. The game is free to play, and through the link below you get a bonus of 3 days of premium time and several orders for troops and weapons. Check it out. Alright, let's get started. So first, which sword do I personally consider the best for battlefield use? Not, and this is going to make some of you cry in anguish, the Gladius. I don't have a historical one, I just have this post-apocalyptic take on it by Zombie Tools. I do not consider this the best one. It was great at its time for the purpose, the equipment that it was used together with, but history has moved on. This is no longer the best. There are plenty of other swords that could be used in the same way. Heck, even a Messer, in my mind, is better than a Gladius at this particular purpose. Because if we compare them, again, this is not historically accurate, but you know, these are both short. This is also great at thrusting, and it is extremely light and fast. Yeah, give a Roman legionary the same kind of equipment and a Messer, I'm gonna bet they would do better. They might be too culturally conservative to consider that. They might be like, I don't want this. This is not what I was trained with. But it's got more going on. The Gladius has a very simple hilt. There's no guard. There's nothing really. It's pretty simple. Not that it's bad. It's just we have advanced significantly. This is a better design, in my opinion. The arming sword has obviously proven itself on medieval battlefields. Used together with a shield, it's quite a formidable weapon. It is well balanced, again, depending on the type, but generally they are pretty light and agile. They cut and thrust. What more could you want, right? Well, how about more hand protection? And they did that. First, they started out adding an additional ring here so you can put your finger over the guard and use it for more precise thrusts. And then they added more and more because, well, why not? The hand is rather exposed. So, yeah, it's good, but it was eclipsed. And where has the battlefield evolution led with regard to hand protection? The basket hilt sword. Perfect hand protection. You literally can't have any more, right? So, no doubt, this has got to be the best. No, I don't think so. For a few reasons. One, these are clunky. Again, there's variation in dimensions and weight and balance to an extent. This one here is somewhat heavy. There are lighter ones, but either way, all of them have something in common. That is, you have a lot of mass right here by necessity. There's plenty of metal. And you can shape them in a different way. But if you want a full basket to protect the hand, there's going to be a substantial amount of metal here, right? So when you bring the balance further back, in a way that's good, right? Because now you have more tip control, you can react faster. But this is still supposed to be a cutting sword. Cut and thrust, but there's definitely emphasis on the cut here. So you need a certain amount of blade presence to pull that off. So you have a certain amount of mass in the blade, and then you add all of this at the end. You don't want the balance to be extremely far back. So what happens? The whole thing gets heavier on average. So even though the balance generally is favorable for agility, now you definitely have a hefty piece of metal in your hand, and it does slow your movements compared to something that is overall lighter. In all fairness, I may be overstating this issue. Some basket hilt swords are indeed quite heavy for single-handed use. This one, for instance, is in the upper range of longsword weight. Others are surprisingly light. I've handled and cut with a Schiavona that felt perfectly nimble and lively. Even though I'm pointing out some downside for the sake of comparing swords in excessive detail, I do think they rank very highly either way. The second issue is that it limits the grips you can use. Like, you're pretty much limited to one particular grip. It's hammer grip. That's about it. Like, even if I try, I can't really use any kind of grip, like handshake grip, saber grip, whatever. That's it. Like, my hand is pretty much locked in here in a certain way, and it also limits how far I can move my wrist. And third, this is pretty complex. So you can't hammer out a bunch of these as quickly as you can a simpler type of sword, which matters for equipping a large number of fighters. So if you want to equip, say 100 men or 1,000 or whatever with these, it'll cost you quite a bit more than something a little bit simpler. When it comes to personal protection, there's another issue. These are not comfortable to carry because you've got this massive steel bulb hanging on your side, digging into your body and just being generally a nuisance. I would not want to have to carry this in everyday life in historical times. That doesn't matter in a duel context or on the battlefield. You can transport it one way or another, even if it's by horse or in a box or just carrying it on your shoulder like this, whatever. It's all going to be easier than having to work around this thing on your hip. The best design for battlefield use in my mind is a tie between a military side sword and a saber. Not this kind of side sword, this is already too fancy. Something less complex, because again, outfitting a larger number of men with something that has a complex hilt is going to be more costly than something like this. It's a Hungarian saber, but later military sabers come in so many different forms, and there's plenty to choose from. Some are better, some are worse. There's also some personal preference, of course. But basically, The difference here is, do you prefer thrusts or cuts? Both are capable of both. It's just one is a little bit better at thrusts, the other is a little bit better at cuts. And I say this even though I'm not even a fan of mini sabers. Particularly as you go further in time, 18th, 19th century, I just lose interest. So what do I think is so good about this? And by the way, I don't even really care whether it's curved or straight. Yes, you can argue that a curved blade slices slightly better. I've discussed these things in greater detail. Personally, I don't even think there's a meaningful practical difference for the most part, because it has much more to do with blade shape in other ways, particularly the width, the thickness, the edge grind, all of that. I've discussed that in detail here, card up there. It's also linked in the description below. But if you take the best cutting blade, which would be a wide single edge blade, I don't think the difference between straight and curved is even all that significant. But let's say if you want to optimize absolutely everything, you'd probably go for a wide single edged curved sword. But you don't always want maximum cutting power anyway. You have to balance a number of different traits, which is why a lot of sabers are not super wide, because you also have to take into consideration weight and durability, things like that. If you make it extremely wide and thin, it's going to cut like crazy, but it's going to be easily damaged. Anyway, so this is a good choice because you have some additional hand protections. It's not perfect, obviously. It doesn't wrap all the way around. It doesn't have a bunch of extra guards that protect your hand better, but this is a lot of bang for the buck. This is not as time-consuming and costly to make as something fancier, and this is a good compromise between a number of different things. Again, it can thrust, it can cut, it can do a lot of shenanigans like thrust around a guard and bind and wrench and deliver false edge cuts that come from odd angles, stuff like that. It's not double-edged, but a lot of sabers do have a sharpened false edge. Even if they don't, getting knocked in the head with the spine is also not particularly pleasant. Obviously, they don't do everything. A falchion can have more cutting power, can be better against something like a gambeson, or even deliver more blunt impact on mail, for example. But sabers typically have more reach, they have usually more hand protection, etc. So what about dueling? Rapiers and side swords are where it's at, in my opinion. That's what they excelled at, that's what they were mainly developed for. Now, they're not particularly convenient to carry, in my opinion. People did it back in history. But to me, this is a little clunky, right? You've got a large guard on your side, and it's also awfully long, which you want because it's good to have that reach. So you can, run into things, into other people's swords. None of that matters in a formal duel because you set up in an open field where it's as even as possible so that nobody has a particular advantage or disadvantage. And you can bring it to the field of duel in any way you want. It doesn't matter if it's convenient to carry or whatever, you just do it one way or another. And it's quite good against other types of swords as well, in ways that you wouldn't even expect. Like you would think a longsword is straight up better, 100%, because it's a two-handed sword, and it can cut and thrust. But a rapier can surprisingly hold its own against a longsword, even though it's only single-handed. But the enormous reach definitely has an advantage. The extremely fast thrusts, the binds, all of that. And you can be more versatile by choosing a side sword. There comes a point where it gets difficult to distinguish between a rapier and a side sword because there are a number of swords that look like something in between, like this one here, for example. I mean, it looks sort of rapier-like, doesn't it? Except it has a shorter blade, a wider blade, so it's better at cutting, it doesn't have as much reach. You can tweak it all you want. There's a number of ways in which this can be suited to individual tastes and emphasize one thing or over another, or try to be as balanced as possible. So that's pretty good. That's difficult to beat, in my opinion. There are swords that cut better, there are swords that protect better, there are swords that are easier to carry, But for a duel, for a formal duel, this is where it's at. Okay, finally, self-defense, something to carry around in everyday life. Very different criteria. You don't necessarily want the absolute best sword that is the best at everything, the most versatile, the most blah, 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 whatever. You want something that's easy to carry, okay? So a small sword is exceptionally easy to carry. So it scores very high in that regard, but it's kind of crappy against a lot of other swords. In my opinion, I have seen some sparring of small sword versus rapier where the small sword did surprisingly well. Depends on the user. But personally, I would consider it at a disadvantage because it's that much shorter. It has very little blade presence compared to a rapier. The rapier will just bind it, will just win the bind much more easily. So the small sword needs to rely much more on mobility, agility, speed, finesse. This Chinese Gen would be quite a good option because it is extremely light and low profile. Now, downside is it has almost no guard, but that means you also don't have anything that gets hooked on clothing or pokes you in the side or anything like that. It's very simple, kind of no-nonsense thing. This is very fast to draw. And if you have to, you can deploy it even in fairly confined spaces. It is fairly long, so you do get good reach, but because it's so light, it's not usually much in the way. Now, the grip is a bit long on this one. In fact, you could even argue I shouldn't even count this because, hey, with such a long grip, how's this even single-handed? It's designed as a single-handed sword. You could use it with two hands, but it's designed as single-handed. So it's a bit of an in-between thing. You could classify this as a hand-and-a-half sword. I appreciate the support from Enlisted. Don't forget about the link in the description to get your exclusive bonus. Call me biased because I am, but I do think the Messer shines in this regard. You can choose the blade length because a Messer comes in anything from about this or maybe even a little bit shorter to significantly longer, more like arming sword length. Speaking of length, the Nimcha is an interesting case where, depending on the individual length, I would classify it either as a saber or might consider it even somewhat Messer-like. And you can pick whether you want a knuckle guard or not. I would definitely say yes, because the knuckle guard doesn't really bother you when carrying it as such. What would be an issue is if something stuck out on this side. You know, if you had a ring here or another noggle on this side, that would poke you in the side. That's not the case. It doesn't really get in the way. It's really compact. It doubles as a tool if you need it. You can draw it very fast. It's typically sharpened on the other side as well, so you can use false edge cuts. Even if not, you can bash them with the spine. And there's a good amount of protection for the hand, as much as is practical in my mind, without making it more awkward to carry. And they can be absolutely powerful cutters, but they can also thrust quite well. So you've got a lot in a small package. Excellent offense, defense, and ease of carry. I would also include similar weapons like a cutlass, for example, or a short falchion. And a lot of Filipino blades fall under this as well. They're nice and compact. Some have knuckle guards, and they're also usable as tools. There's plenty here that falls into a general category of not just Messer, but generally single-edged, compact sword with decent guard. All right, now you can start angrily typing and debating because I ditched your favorite and put something on the pedestal that you think is trash. So let's try to be somewhat civil. We don't need actual duels in the comments. Then again, all engagement is good from an algorithm point of view. So yes, flame war each other all you want, roast each other, roast me, roast everything, as long as you type. In all seriousness though, thank you for watching. I appreciate it. Hope you found it interesting and entertaining, and take care.